Welcome to our review on stem cells. First thing we need to know then is what on earth is a stem cell? And quite simply, they are undifferentiated cells. Now, once we've got these stem cells, these undifferentiated cells, they can divide to produce lots of undifferentiated cells, and those undifferentiated cells can then differentiate into other cell types. When we think about where we find these stem cells in humans, then we've got two types we need to concern ourselves with. The first one are the embryonic stem cells, which can actually differentiate into any type of cell. So these ones are incredibly interesting in terms of their potential applications in medicine. As their name suggests from embryonic, then they are found in embryos. The second type are the adult stem cells, and these are only found in certain locations in mature organisms, so places like your bone marrow, for example. And what we find is that the adult stem cells can only turn into a limited number of cell types. So from your bone marrow, those can actually only turn into different types of blood cells, for example. It's not just animals that have stem cells. We also find stem cells in plants. The place that we find the plant stem cells is in a region called the meristem, which are in the actively growing regions of our plants, so the tips of the roots and the tips of the shoots. What we find is that with meristem cells, they're capable of growing throughout the entire life of the plant, and they can differentiate into any cell type. So that's a clear difference between the ones that we find in humans and the ones that we find in plants. What we need to consider now then is, why do we really care about these meristems and stem cells? Well, if we're thinking about how we can use them in plants, then we can use the meristem cells to produce clones of our plants really quickly and really cheaply. So that gives us two really important uses. The first one is, if we've got a rare plant, then we can actually protect it from extinction by producing large numbers of clones of that rare plant. The second is that we can produce these very large numbers of our crop plants that have desired characteristics. So if you've got a plant that's resistant to a certain disease, then we can use the meristem cells then to clone large numbers of them in a very short space of time and for a very limited amount of money. If we now turn our attention to our human stem cells and start off by thinking about the adult stem cells. Now, we've actually been using adult stem cells for treating diseases for quite some time now. And the most common one that you've probably heard of is the use of bone marrow transplants for people with certain conditions like sickle cell anemia. The embryonic stem cells are actually potentially a lot more exciting, because these can actually be used to replace faulty cells in a really wide range of conditions. And one of the processes that uses these embryonic stem cells is something called therapeutic cloning. So this is where we produce an embryo with the same genes as the patient, so that when we take those stem cells from the embryo, then we can use them in that patient without any risk of rejection, because all of those genes will be identical to the patient themselves. Even though this whole concept of using stem cells to treat all of these diseases sounds absolutely amazing, and you might be sitting there thinking, why on earth are we not doing this on a massive scale right now? The simple answer is that there are some risks and concerns that we need to address. So the first one is that we could potentially transfer viruses from our stem cells into our patient if those cells were to become contaminated within the lab. So that's one problem. The next is that side of things where we've got ethical and religious objections to a certain practice. And we do find there's quite a number of those associated with our stem cells. As we've already said, one of the most exciting types of stem cell are those that come from embryos. So there will be a reasonable number of people who will object to the use of cells that come from embryos, because the argument is it could have been a living person, so we're kind of just stealing those cells and ending its life. However, we can counter that argument because a lot of these embryos actually come as the surplus from fertility treatments like IVF. So they may well extract 10 different cells and they're all fertilized in a lab, but only one would be implanted into the mother. So there's 9 extra little embryos that we can then use for stem cell research that otherwise would have been destroyed. Obviously, there are some people who have religious objections here because we are doing things that obviously in religion is something that God takes care of. So just bear those ethical and religious concerns in mind. To try to alleviate some of these issues, we do have very strict guidelines on the use of our embryonic stem cells in research in the UK. So even so far as how many days they can exist within a lab before they must be terminated. Hopefully at the end of this video you can recall what a stem cell is, you can recall where they're found in both plants and animals and the different types. You can also recall the potential uses and some of those risks and concerns associated with stem cells.